Namaste, blessed love and peace. This is a 1 hour walk-through of the Gospels, part uno, which includes the Gospel of Matthew. Here it is. Bismillah ar-Rahmani ar-Rahim. Allah wabha. 道可道非常道，名可名非常名。Já Rastafari. Deus noster qui es in cielo sanctificato nomen tuum. Vaheguru sanam. Baruch ata Elohim Eloheinu melech haolam asher quitzanu bo mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'sok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Kyrie eleison. Sivamastu savejikatahim. Sabe sata bhavantu sukhitata. Vagabiyam, Aquaba, Upendo na Amani, Fikiri Neslami, Chinta Dan Peramian, Libo Famiam, Umanjika, Ubuntu, Shabono, Fakitka. Session, Kamasunida, Domo Arigato, Pilama Yellow Wakan Toka, Talk or Dokashin Good, Go Remit Agat. God, we thank you for all with which you bless us. Ata jam yata afanami. Mado, aho, om shanti shanti shanti. Amen. So we begin with Matthew chapter 1. Matthew begins, the gospel according to St. Matthew, begins with giving a genealogy of the lineage that Jesus is born into. It begins with Avraham Avinu, and then it describes 14 generations from Avraham Avinu to David, and from 14 generations from David onto the exile to Babylon, and 14 generations from the exile of Babylon to the birth of Jesus. Jesus is born to Joseph and Mary, and that is what leads to the conclusion of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, the chapter 2. Joseph, his father, receives a dream to stay with Mary even though she is pregnant without him having yet married her. She is betrothed to him, but they have yet to consummate the marriage. But he receives a dream to stay with her and raise the child. So they go to Bethlehem, where Jesus is born, and that this is shared in chapter 2. There's reference to the prophecy concerning the birth in Bethlehem. Herod is visited by the wise men who see the star indicating the birth of Jesus and go to visit this site. And Herod is alarmed because the prospect of Jesus being born in Israel at that moment signifies the conclusion of his reign. So, when Herod receives that notification, he tries to find out where Jesus is born. The wise men leave through another route, knowing of Herod's treachery, and Herod decides to kill all the other children born in the region, in the area around Bethlehem during that period. Joseph again receives a dream warning him of this and flees to Egypt. And that is upon the conclusion of Herod's reign, Joseph receives a sign again, a signal, a message to return to Nazareth. And that is where the family of Jesus settles, and that it concludes chapter 2. Into chapter 3, we are introduced to John the Baptist, who is actually a relative of Jesus' cousin. And John the Baptist is arisen as a leader, as a prophetic voice within Israel. He is baptizing people and warning the people of repentance and path of righteousness. And he challenges the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees during that period. And he prophesies of another leader arriving who exceeds his own authority. And at that point, Jesus arrives and is baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist says that he needs to be baptized by Jesus, but Jesus says, let us fulfill the protocols. So that concludes, once Jesus is baptized, the Spirit of God descends like a dove, it says, looking at verse 16, 16, and that concludes chapter 3 and begins chapter 4. From that point, Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness and is tempted by the devil. And the devil, there are three prominent temptations that are articulated within the chapter, and Jesus resists each one. It includes glory and power and pride, actually. And so once Jesus progresses beyond the temptations of the devil, he is ministered to by angels. And from that point, looking at chapter 4, verse 11, and then the next verse, Jesus begins his ministry. He emerges into his ministry. And this is the point where it is articulated in verse 12 that John the Baptist is arrested. So there is the decline of John the Baptist's walk as he is arrested, his ministry, his outreach, and there is the ascension of Jesus's ministry and outreach. And so again, Jesus also preaches repentance, looking at chapter 4, verse 17, and he meets his first disciples, Peter and Andrew, the brothers, who are fishermen. And Jesus says, I'll make you fishers of men. And it shows, there's further description of how Jesus provides his ministry. He says in verse 23, and he went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the sovereignty and healing every disease and every infirmity amongst the people. So this begins the foundation of what Jesus' ministry is, preaching, healing, and going into the synagogues, various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and healing each one. And it describes some of the locations: Galilee, Decapolis, and Jerusalem, and Judea, and beyond the Jordan River. And that concludes chapter 4. And then when we arrive at chapter 5, and this is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is essentially the framework of the teachings that Jesus provides. And it begins with the Beatitudes. And the blessed are the poor in spirit, looking at verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the sovereignty of heaven. And there are eight proclamations in the Beatitudes that Jesus provides. There's a lot of density, intensity, and revelation that is shared simply just within the Beatitudes. That's ripe for considerable study and meditation. So from the Beatitudes, Jesus, again, it's a proclamation, it's an affirmation of spirit within the listener, a spiritual affirmation, and that reaches the spirit, the heart, the mind, and the body, on earth and in heaven. Jesus continues in verse 13 by saying, you are the salt of the earth. And then in verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid. And nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your benevolent works and give glory to your Creator who is in heaven. And then Jesus also proclaims that he is not come to eradicate the laws, to change things. That think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Looking at verse 17 in chapter 5. And then in affirming the laws that Moshe Rabbeinu provides, well, looking at verse, yeah, because this is beneficial to include. He further affirms, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the sovereignty of heaven." So, again, there's an affirmation of the laws that the contemporary authorities know, but recognizing that the contemporary authorities are hypocritical, and so rather than lambasting the authorities and the law, it's a matter of recognizing the legitimacy of the law and practicing that in a way that is a further genuine and righteous than the actual contemporary authorities. The intention of these walkthroughs is to be factual rather than commentary, so I'm going to focus on that. So some of those rules, some of those laws include not killing, not committing adultery, including the denouncement of divorces, and a man being continually loyal to the wife he marries, except for the case of a woman committing adultery. Another rule is being honest, looking at verse 33. You shall not bear false witness. And there's the reflexive maxim of an eye for an eye, and Jesus saying, responding to that by saying, but I say to you, do not resist one who is evil, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Looking at verse 39. So it says further in verse 43, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So again, it's a teaching of tremendous and extraordinary love that Jesus provides here in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, the first chapter describing the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 6 begins by stating, proclaim, beware of practicing your piety before men in order to be seen by them. So humility, modesty, worrying less about appearances and pretenses, and being genuine, particularly in one's relationship and communication with God. Modesty when providing charity, not to be a braggart and ostentatious, but to provide charity in a humble way, pray in a humble way, in a quiet place, and to be sincere, to worry less about a lot of words, and to simply communicate honestly and genuinely directly with God. And this is also where Jesus provides the what is referred to as the Lord's Prayer. Our God who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy sovereignty come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Looking at verses 9 to 13. Also, this is from the Revised Standard Version I'm reading from. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Creator also will forgive you. So, looking at that reflexive relationship again between earth and heaven, how we treat others here on earth is how we are treated in our relationship in heaven. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth or rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. Looking at verse 19 a 20, 19 through 20. Again, continuing on from there in verse 21, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Again, describing the living for the experience of earth and living for the experience of heaven, the distinction between the two, and to worry less about the earthly concerns and to focus increasingly on the heavenly concerns. And in focusing on the heavenly concerns, the earthly concerns are addressed accordingly, recognizing that God knows everything that we need. So Jesus concludes this passage by stating in verse 33, but seek first God's sovereignty and God's righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. So then chapter 7 begins by stating, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And the measure you give will be the measure you get. That's looking at verse 1 through 2, 1 through 2, 1 a 2. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? So that's looking at chapter 3, verse 3. So again, this notion of the golden rule in these many different facets, and the equal balance of how we reach out and how we are reached towards. And Jesus continues by speaking in very brief parables or metaphors, talking about giving of gifts and being honest in giving our gifts, and knowing that we know how to give benevolent gifts, and so God knows how to give even greater gifts. So to trust in that generosity and in that relationship. Jesus describes that discipline as a narrow gate, because wide is the gate of temptation and leading astray. So it is a matter of staying on the path that is comparatively narrow. And in that process, to beware of false prophets, looking at verse 15. And one of the ways of distinguishing false prophets is by looking at the fruits of the work. While some may have very nice words, it's a matter of looking at the works and seeing how the person is living and what the person is doing to promote the well-being of others. And Jesus warns that those who look at and practice the aesthetic, the superficial components of proclamations, of just speaking words, are unrecognized in the final judgment. And it is those who do the works. So the words and the works are important and essential. And the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, concludes with, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So that gives an indication of the nature of authority during that period, whereby Israel is under the sovereign rule of another entity, Rome, and so there is that military authority, but at the same time there's a religious authority. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and additionally, but the nature of that authority, as described here, is comparatively genteel, and perhaps passive in terms of its communication and reign upon the populace. But Jesus is speaking with direct authority, and so it's surprising that someone who's speaking these words of heaven is speaking with this type of direct authority. So that concludes chapter 7. So we get into chapter 8. And so it says, when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Master, if you will, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. That's verse 1 a 3. And Jesus commands him to say nothing, to be modest, keep it quiet, um, uh, and to continue to provide the prescribed offering that Moshe Rabbeinu says when receiving healing. So that's an indication again of Jesus continuing in the law that Moshe Rabbeinu prescribes in the Torah. So Jesus heals the servant of a centurion, and is surprised by the faith that the centurion has within Jesus. Jesus enters into Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is sick. Jesus heals her, and so this provides an indication of the tangible experience, the temporal experience, the pragmatic experience of going from house to house. Jesus being without a direct house for himself, presumably, at least as articulated within the Gospels, and so staying at other people's houses, and in staying at other people's houses, being involved in the actual experiences of the people, and healing the sick, having conversations, partaking of the food, and additionally. And this is articulated further in chapter 8 with chapter 19, which is, and a scribe came over to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." That's continuing with verse 19 through 20. 19 a 20. So from there's this scenario of being on the lake, or it actually just says the boat, and there is tumultuous weather, rain and winds, and Jesus is asleep. His apostles are scared, and wake him, and Jesus calms the elements, and his apostles are amazed at his command of the elements, and so this is another sign signifying the ministry that Jesus provides. Jesus heals the man, the legion, who is afflicted with the legion, and sends the spirits into the pigs that run into the water, and that concludes chapter 8. And again, getting into a boat, he crossed over and came to his own city. That's beginning chapter 9, chapter 9, verse 1. Again, further people with afflictions seek healing from him, and he heals them. In this particular instance, he heals a man and says his sins are forgiven, and he's accused of blasphemy. And so this is the first direct interaction and criticism from the scribes and the leaders of Israel towards Jesus. And Jesus explains and provides a rationale for the forgiveness, and upon his explanation, the narrative continues. The man is healed after that. From there, Jesus sees Matthew, the tax collector, and summons Matthew to become an apostle of his as well. And again, Jesus is in the house, and the Pharisees question Jesus' disciples about why Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus provides another explanation, direct explanation in response to the questions. And then the disciples of John the Baptist approach Jesus and ask Jesus if he is, why everyone else fasts, but Jesus' disciples do not fast. And Jesus gives her an explanation for that, again, a direct response. Jesus heals a daughter who is sick. People perceive her as dead, but Jesus says that she is alive, and he heals her. Jesus heals blind men. There's when Jesus is on his way to heal that girl, there's a woman who touches the fringe of his garment and is made well. Notices the power that is taken from him by the woman touching him, and the woman comes forth and admits her what she does in terms of seeking healing, and Jesus gives her well tidings. Then Jesus heals the daughter, and then two blind men seek healing from Jesus as well, and Jesus heals them as they believe in him being able to heal them, and from this it says that again Jesus says it still in chapter 9, and their eyes were open. This is verse 30. And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly charged them, see that no one knows it. But they went away and spread his fame through all that district. So again, Jesus is soliciting humbleness, quiet, modesty in terms of the ministry, but people are going and just proclaiming what Jesus does for them. Crowds and crowds continue to gather around him. And Jesus has compassion for them because he knows the people are afflicted. And that is what concludes chapter 10. That was what concludes chapter 9 and begins chapter 10. So in chapter 10, the 12 apostles are named. And this is actually a different sequence of names than in other gospels, which is a part of the comparative study and learning. And then from naming the 12 disciples, Jesus sends them out and gives them instructions to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And this is beginning from verse 8 to 10. Continuing on with 11, and whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it, and stay with him until you depart. As you enter the house, salute it, and if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it, but if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. So Jesus is giving, again, these pragmatic instructions to his disciples concerning how to share in the ministry and provide the same service of healing. Warning them about the affliction that confronts the disciples and how to deal with it, not to be anxious about it, but to work in the Spirit of God and to allow the Spirit of God to move the disciples in response to the affliction. So rather than planning and plotting and strategizing, just to be genuine in the walk, genuine in serving and healing people, and whenever there is some type of confrontation, to address it at that moment rather than anticipating it, rather than worrying about it, but just to focus on the benevolent works. Jesus also describes his disciples as his disciples. And the warnings and guidance continue through chapter 10. There is a provocative proclamation that states, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." Essentially, this is describing how not an actual sword, not a violent sword, but a truth that separates the rote bonds of even blood and family, whereby instead of just maintaining allegiance regardless of what other people do, brother, mother, father, sister, rather than just having that type of rote allegiance. I'm explaining something, but it's supposed to not just this. It's a matter of if somebody does something and saying, "Oh, that's my family member, I have to stay with them regardless," it's a matter of saying, "No, that's not right." Even though it is my family member, I have to recognize what is right and proceed accordingly. So it doesn't mean categorical abandoning or forsaking of family members, but is recognizing that there's a truth that is further priority than even the tie of family and the blood ties. So that is what Jesus is proclaiming here, and that is what concludes chapter 10. Chapter 11 goes further into the narrative of the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist is still in prison. He sends his disciples to ask if Jesus is the Messiah, Moshiach, and Jesus responds to the disciples by saying in verse 4, "Go and tell John what you hear and see: the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have benevolent news preached to them. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me." That's 4:6, verse 4 to 6. And then so Jesus from that point affirms the leadership of and the baptism that John the Baptist provides to people, and describes the nature of the prophetic walk, that it's not people who are higher ups in convention with fancy, expensive clothing and additionally, but simple people who provide a simple but significant truth. And then from this point, Jesus begins to provide a warning for those who abstain from responding to the message that John the Baptist shares and that Jesus shares. Looking at verse 16, "But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their playmates. We piped to you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not grieve." So this is where Jesus begins to upbraid the city, looking at verse 20, who do not repent, and where the miracles are done, where the signs are provided, yet people abstain from changing and people abstain from responding and changing their ways and becoming properly righteous. So Jesus provides this warning and begins to proclaim woe to those places because of the absence of repentance. And in concluding chapter 11, Jesus says in verse 29, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." In chapter 12, Jesus is walking through the grain fields with his disciples. During Shabbat, his disciples begin to take some of the grains, and the Pharisees see it and criticize Jesus. And then Jesus again responds directly and gives the example of David eating the bread of presence, and again explaining the actions of his disciples. Then the interaction between the religious leadership, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and Jesus becomes increasingly intense during the chronology, the sequence of the gospel. So initially it's questioning, challenging, and Jesus responds by providing direct explanation, citing some previous teachings from the Torah, and additionally some from the Tanakh, but being responsive, and also at the same time in telling his disciples, the ones who are receiving his healing and his services, to be modest and to be quiet. But the challenges from the Pharisees and the Sadducees continue, and the message, the proclamations from those who are healed continues to increase. So Jesus is getting increased notoriety, and then also increased scrutiny from the leadership, from the conventional leadership. And so Jesus' response also adjusts to these conditions. And so here we see in chapter 12, again, another interaction between the leaders and Jesus, asking about healing during Shabbat. Jesus gives another response, and after giving the response, he heals the man right in front of the man, right in front of the leaders. And so from that point, it states, but the Pharisees went out and took counsel against him how to destroy him. So now the contention is getting increasingly intense. And it says again in verse 15, chapter 12, verse 15, Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. And many followed him, and he healed them all and ordered them not to make him known. So there's a reference to Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah. Jesus heals further people are amazed. The Pharisees accuse him of being possessed by a demon, by Satan. And Jesus says that describes that if Satan is possessing somebody who is healing, that means Satan is divided against himself, and that doesn't last. And so he starts to challenge the critics. By stating that these works are evident, and it's necessary for the skeptics to genuinely discern where these benevolent works are being done, for the benefit of the skeptics, because the continuing criticism of the benevolent works coming from God, coming from heaven, leads to adverse consequences. Jesus says in verse 30, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. So now Jesus is starting to respond with strength accordingly, and to provide his own criticism, even going so much further in verse 34, 34, you brood of vipers, how can you speak benevolence when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The benevolent man out of his benevolent treasure brings forth benevolence, and the evil man out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. So now Jesus is returning the scrutiny, and in the conclusion of chapter 12, Jesus proclaims that all who live by the way of God are his family. And that concludes chapter 12. From this point, Jesus starts to talk in parables, in-depth parables. Here we see the sower who drops seed upon benevolent soil, upon thorns, and the difference that those seeds experience when raised. Some being choked by thorns, some withering without being rooted, and then those that fall into the benevolent soil, growing multifold. When his apostles ask him about the meaning of that parable, Jesus explains it in further detail. Jesus provides another parable about the man who sabotages the seed sown in the soil. That being a metaphor of the devil, the tempter, and the interaction with the works that Jesus is sharing. Then Jesus provides the parable of the mustard seed. Again, um, benevolent works being multifold. So Jesus is sharing these parables in the nature of the labor, the nature of the experience that the masses are immersed within. So rather than giving these direct proclamations as it is within the Sermon on the Mount of the sovereignty of heaven, it's a powerful message, and oftentimes it's too powerful for people to readily absorb. And so now Jesus is speaking in parables that relate experiences and the nature of that spiritual awakening in the context that people are living at that moment, day in and day out. So even in the process of that labor, people can be mindful of that relationship and the nature of the sovereignty of heaven and how it exists even within the immediate works that people are involved within. Further parables about the sovereignty of heaven. The net being thrown into the sea, and additionally. So after sharing all of this, additional people begin to question who Jesus is, and he goes into his own homeland, and everybody says, "We know this guy from growing up, and so how can this be somebody special?" And Jesus from that proclaims in verse 57, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. And then in chapter 14, halfway through the Gospel of Matthew, Herod executes John the Baptist. Herod provides a party. His daughter-in-law charms him and asks. He offers his daughter-in-law any gift that she asks for, and her more, which is his wife, who is hateful towards hateful towards John the Baptist, solicits her daughter to tell Herod to provide the head of John the Baptist on the platter. So that's what he does. And it says in verse 13, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place apart. So now we're seeing, again, the tangible reaction. Jesus is doing these amazing works. He's getting challenged. And now the stakes are shown as being severe, because now his cousin, who was doing the righteous works before him, who was in jail, has been executed. And now Jesus sees what's happening, what the stakes are. And from there, retires to a lonely place. But even then, crowds follow him, and in the lonely place, thousands around him, and there's no food. So Jesus instructs his disciples, have them sit, and provides bread from just a few loaves to feed the thousands of people. Again, going on to the boat in the waters, challenging weather. Jesus walks to the boat. His disciples are on the boat alone, and he walks to the boat on water, and summons Peter to walk with him, given Peter's initiation, interest in solicitation to walk with him, but Peter begins to sink because of a lack of faith. Even when arriving on shore, he is approached by those who need healing, and Jesus heals them. And that concludes chapter 14. Going into chapter 15, Jesus is asked again about why his disciples eat without washing hands. Jesus again responds directly, and calls his accusers hypocrites by looking at the aesthetic of the letter of the law without actually practicing the substance of the spirit of the law. And Jesus heals a daughter who is possessed by a demon. Jesus again retires to a mountain. Again, we're still in chapter 15, chapter 15, and is still followed by the crowds to have healing. Again, again provides thousands of people from just a few loaves. And again, it concludes chapter 15 with verse 39. And sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. So now we have a sequence of challenges from the Pharisees and Sadducees that are increasingly involved. First, they ask for a sign, and Jesus deflects and provides other signs that are provided, and that saying that those who ask for signs do not even know how to recognize the signs. And later in chapter 16, Jesus asks his disciples who they think he is, and Peter proclaims him as Moshiach. And Jesus proclaims Peter as the inheritor of the leadership of the ministry upon Jesus' resurrection. And it is from this point that Jesus begins to describe to his disciples what is approaching in Jerusalem, the crucifixion, and additionally, Peter describes that he'll protect him, and Jesus says that this is part of the walk. In chapter 17, Jesus goes upon a high mountain with Peter and James and John, and there is ministered to by Moshe Rabbeinu and Elijah. And his disciples see this, and then the voice of God is heard, and his disciples are frightened, and eventually the vision subsides, and Jesus explains to his disciples what that is and what is proceeding from there. Again, Jesus heals another child, and Peter is asked later whether Jesus pays the tax. Peter says yes, and then goes to ask Jesus, and Jesus describes the dishonesty within the taxation. But because Peter had already responded, Jesus provides the method for Peter to make true that proclamation. In chapter 18, 18, his disciples begin to compete with each other about who is the greatest amongst the disciples. Here it actually says the specific articulation is, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the sovereignty of heaven?" And Jesus says that, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the sovereignty of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child, he is the greatest in the sovereignty of heaven." So there's an actual another specific incident where the disciples are compete with each other, but that's distinct from what this is right here. So again, Jesus explains the importance of humility, humbleness, modesty, and reconciliation amongst kinfolk. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's chapter 15. And then later on, Peter asks, "Master, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. That's verse 21 a 22. So again, now Jesus is talking about forgiveness, the sovereignty of heaven being based upon forgiveness. an experience of thorough forgiveness, and provides additional parables to describe that. And again, here we have in chapter 19, chapter 19, Pharisees coming up to him and asking about the legality of divorcing a wife. And Jesus says that such divorce is prohibitive. And so then he's asked, well, then why Moshe Rabbeinu allows a man to provide his wife with a certificate of divorce and put her away? Jesus says it's the hardness of heart. So Jesus affirms the institution of marriage, and in chapter verse 6 says, actually, the first response that Jesus provides is in verse 4. He answered, "Have you not read that God who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his far and more and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Whatever God has joined together, let not man put asunder." And so then he's asked about giving the divorce, and that's when he describes the hardness of heart. And actually from that point, his disciples approach him later and say that it may be beneficial not to marry at all. And Jesus says, for he who has ears to hear, let him hear. The notion of being oneself, making oneself a eunuch for the sake of the sovereignty of heaven, for those who have ears to hear. Another person asks Jesus later in chapter 19, "Teacher, what benevolent deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you ask me about what is divine? One there is who is divine. If you would enter life, keep the commandments." And Jesus confirms the commandments, and the man says that he's lived all those. What else does he lack? And Jesus says that he is rich and to give everything that he has and follow Jesus. And the man was very sad because he was very rich. And Jesus proclaims it is easier for the camel to travel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the sovereignty of heaven. Again, looking at the duality between earth and heaven. Jesus provides additional metaphors describing the sovereignty of heaven. Laborers working in the field and providing, some working further than others, and all being provided the same wage, and the intrinsic fairness within that, because all agreed to that wage. The mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, asks for her sons to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus in heaven. And Jesus says that's not for him to offer. It is up to God to offer those things. And here we see again the rivalry amongst the disciples, because the other disciples are jealous or upset because that they asked for that honor in heaven. So Jesus again says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles mastered over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so amongst you, but whoever would be great amongst you must be your servant, and whoever would be first amongst you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So again, Jesus is talking about the predominance of providing healing, serving others, and the humbleness and the modesty within that. Chapter 21, Jesus is approaching Yerushalayim, and arrives on the foal of an ass, the colt, and the people are making are responding and providing clothes and branches on the road to greet Jesus' arrival into Yerushalayim. Jesus enters the temple, drives out the people who are selling and exchanging money in the temple, proclaiming that such behavior, such actions diminishes the holiness within the temple. The next day, Jesus goes to the fig tree and it does not find any fruit, and curses the fig tree, and the fig tree withers, and his disciples are amazed. The chief priests and the elders ask him by what authority he's doing these things, and Jesus proclaims a question to them about the authority of John the Baptist, whether it was from heaven or from earth. The authorities aren't able to respond to him because if they say yes, it was from heaven, then Jesus will say, well, then why didn't you believe him? If they say no, then they risk the vitriol of the people, because the people believe in John the Baptist. So because they aren't able to answer Jesus, Jesus says, then I'm not going to answer you. And so Jesus provides additional parables concerning justice from heaven, and additionally, and then in chapter 22, additional parables describing the sovereignty of heaven. The Sadducees ask him another question about a number of brothers who marry the same woman, and in heaven, whose wife is she? And Jesus says that people are like angels in heaven, and so the question is erroneous. And it is described that in verse 33 of chapter 22, and when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. That is chapter 22, chapter 22, verse 34 a 40, verse 34 to 40. So they ask him one other question, and Jesus asks them a question. And when Jesus poses this question, there is an absence of an answer, and from there the questions stop. And again, Jesus proclaims the truth within the teachings of Moshe Rabbeinu, but that the teachers of the law abstain from practicing it. And so it's a matter of continuing to look at the law, but to respect those who have a knowledge about the law, but to abstain from doing the same thing that those teachers do because they don't practice the law. That's chapter 23, 23. And then again, Jesus proclaims, woe, woe, woe to the scribes and the Pharisees, the blind guides, hypocrites, and that continues for the rest of 23, chapter 23. Jesus leaves the temple, and his disciples are pointing out all the different buildings in the city of Yerushalayim, and Jesus says that all that is temporary, impermanent. And it is at this point in chapter 24 that Jesus prepares his disciples for inheriting the authority, proclaiming what is approaching in terms of the crucifixion and resurrection, and preparing his disciples to continue in the ministry that Jesus establishes, and how to navigate the challenges that are in front of his disciples upon his crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus provides additional parables in chapter 25 about the sovereignty of heaven. Um, and in the conclusion of chapter 25, Jesus also again provides that description about the distinction between those who actually do the works and those who just go through the motions of the aesthetics, talking about being healed. Those at his right hand are those who fed him when he was hungry, clothed him when he was in need of clothing, visited him when he was sick, visited him when he was in prison, and welcomed him as a stranger. They ask him, "When did we see you as any of these?" And he says, "As you did it to the least of these, you did it to me." And again, those who didn't do those things, even though they were claiming him as their master and doing all these things in his name, weren't doing those things in terms of helping people in who are hungry, who are naked, who are in jail, who are sick. And additionally, and Jesus says, "As you didn't do it to these of mine, you didn't do it to me." And so that concludes chapter 25. And so we arrive at the dinner table where the woman provides the expensive ointment to cleanse Jesus. His disciples criticize her, but he defends her and says the reason for the action and Pesach arrives, the Passover, and so he and his disciples have the Last Supper, the Pesach, the Seder, and it is here where Jesus describes the betrayer and what is about to happen. This is in chapter 26. And when, after the dinner, he is confronted by the crowd, his accosters, his disciples flee and abandon him. He is seized and he is taken to Caiaphas, the high priest, and he is put in a trial and interrogated, and he stands his ground, and from that interaction, he is condemned to death. In that process, Peter denies him 3 times before the cock crows, and he remembers what Jesus proclaims in terms of the eventual betrayal that Peter would do towards Jesus, and Peter goes and cries, weeps bitterly, and that concludes chapter 26. The next morning, the chief priests and elders lead Jesus to Pilate, the governor. And Judas, who betrays Jesus, who sold him out to the leadership, sees what he has done and returns the silver that he had received as payment and hangs himself. This is in chapter 27, 27. And then at the same time, Jesus is led to his crucifixion. Pilate interrogates him briefly, and the crowds are very unruly in terms of soliciting the crucifixion of Jesus, even though Pilate has difficulty seeing anything deserving death in Jesus' behavior, but he acquiesces to the crowd, and he washes his hands before the crowd, signifying that he doesn't agree, but he's abiding by the rule of the crowd. And then at that point, Jesus is crucified and ridiculed, mocked, and insulted, disrespected, and Now from the 6th hour, reading from verse 45 in chapter 27. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour, and about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And concluding with verse 50, and Jesus cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And his body is taken away by another brother named Joseph, and wrapped and put into a tomb. And that concludes chapter 17. So we go into the concluding chapter of Matthew, which is 28. After Shabbat, so after 2 days, is the first day of the week after Shabbat, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the sepulchre. That is reading from verse 1. There was an earthquake. Angel of God descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat upon it. And the angel explains that Jesus is risen. And from there, Jesus is reunited with his disciples and gives his disciples instructions on how to continue in the ministry. And that concludes chapter 28 and the Gospel of Matthew. So that is the narrative, and that is this session, part uno. The next session, part dos, includes Mark, Luke, and John, God willing. Alhamdulillah, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allahu Akbar. 道可道非常道，名可名非常名，já Rastafari. Deus nos daqui essenciales santificita nomen tuum, vaheguru sanam. Baruch atah Elohim, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher ksanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'sok b'devrei Torah. Amen. Kyrie eleison, sivamas tu savjagatehi, sabes atah b'avantu sukitata. Vagabiyam. Aquaba, upendo na amani, for Kyrie nesilami, chinda dan penamen, labor of me, woman jaga. Ubuntu shubanda fikitka. 谢谢 Kamosunina Damo Arigato Pilama Yela Wakatako Toko Doko Shingu and Gomadagat. God, we thank you for all that you bless us. Ata Jamia Yata Afanami. Mado Ho Gom Shanti Shanti Shanti. Amen. All thanks and praise to the Most High Elohim. Respect and honor to all our ancestors, all our prophets, all our sages, past and present, known and unknown. Respect and honor to His Majesty Haile Selassie I and Her Majesty Waizara Manan. Blessed love and peace in Rastafari, one perfect love. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom aleichem. Zai Jin. Mado.